Hello, everybody, and welcome to the University of Galway's COP29 briefing number 1, brought to you by the Ryan Institute and the Master's Programme in Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security at our university. My name is Professor Charlie Spillane. I'm the Director of the Master's Programme in Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security. Here at the university, we have the Ryan Institute, which is an interdisciplinary research institute with about 100 research groups conducting research to address the pressing sustainability challenges of our time. And within that research, we have a significant body of research activity to address the climate change mitigation, adaptation, and just transition challenges facing society today. Our award-winning master's program in climate change, agriculture, and food security now has over 200 graduates, the majority of which are agents of change in organizations widely around the globe, where they play important roles in climate action on many fronts. And we're very proud of those graduates, and we hope to attract more talented graduates over time. Each year ahead of the UNFCCC COP Summits, the COP Climate Summits, we ask our students on the Master's Programme on the Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Masters to provide briefings on the key issues leading up to and during each COP Summit. Our students have been diligently assessing and analysing the hot topics to be considered at the intergovernmental negotiations and by the non-state actors at COP29 in Baku over the past weeks. And so we're going to benefit from their analysis today in our first briefing amongst the 3 briefings that we will do over the course of the COP29 summit meeting. Today's briefing we've scheduled for the first day of COP29, and then will be followed by 2 other briefings on Monday, the 18th of November, and on Thursday, the 21st of November. In our next 2 briefings, the students will be joined by University of Galway faculty, including myself and others, and invited guests who are attending COP29 to get their perspectives and views on how COP29 is progressing. So what about COP29 itself? It's now 2024. It's over 30 years since the UNFCCC convention came into effect. The negotiations within the UNFCCC at each successive COP agree on the need and the imperative to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which was further enshrined by the Paris Agreement. However, our planet has already warmed by more than 1.3 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. So despite the rhetoric, the plans and the pledges, the reality is that emissions continue to rise year on year. The multiple impacts of climate change are already being felt by all countries and societies around the world. The World Meteorological Organization's State of the Climate Report indicates that 2023 was the hottest year ever recorded. So as our planet warms due to greenhouse gas emissions, the severity and the frequency of adverse weather events is increasingly generating cascading risks and diverse negative impacts on humanity, livelihoods, economies, and environment. Every year ahead of the UNFCCC COP meetings, we receive alarming reports from the IPCC, from the UNEP, from the International Energy Agency, World Meteorological Organization, FAO, and many others. And all of those reports feed into the decision-making by our respective governments at each of these intergovernmental meetings. The UNEP Emissions Gap Report, as one of those key reports, this year is as alarming as it has been in previous years. Nations must deliver dramatically stronger ambition and action in the next round of NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, or the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree goal will be gone within a few years. The opportunity will have been lost. With current policies and plans, the world faces 2.6 degrees to 3.1 degrees of temperature rise this century. There seems to be a major disconnect between the scientific evidence and the urgency in each successive IPCC assessment report and the flatlining ambition of national plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has indicated that COP29 must drive the necessary surge in climate ambition by all nations. So despite the attention on climate change in all of our societies and discourse associated with that, most of our economies and societies remain on a business as usual trajectory where the rate of emissions reduction and adaptation actions are dramatically below what is needed by 2030, by 2050 and beyond. So COP29 begins with the stark reality that staying within 1.5 degrees is now likely out of reach due to the slow progress in climate mitigation to date. The Precedented systems transitions for emissions reductions across all economies and sectors required in the IPCC 1.5 degree report have not really happened and are not happening with the scale and the speed necessary to reduce emissions to a level to stay within 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees warming by end of century. The key challenge facing the world's governments at COP29 and the communities they represent is how they can raise their ambition and their actions to accelerate to get high emitting countries and societies to net zero in the time frame needed. As the IPCC has warned, and this warning is quite stark, the lack of sufficiently ambitious actions by our governments will leave a legacy of global warming and adverse climate impacts that will reverberate over hundreds and thousands of years. Our decision makers need to consider that their inaction on climate change will negatively impact on the lives of their children's grandchildren. On that note, I'm going to hand over to our master's students who will give the first of our briefings over the next 2 weeks during the next 2 weeks of COP29 in Baku, where they're going to give you an introduction to the COP29 itself, the UNFCCC process, and the key issues on the table at COP29 over the next 2 weeks. So at that, I'm going to hand over to our master's students, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next briefing, and we hope you enjoy and find this briefing useful for your understanding of the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Charlie Spillane, for the warm welcome. Good morning, afternoon, and good evening, everyone from wherever you're watching this from. My name is Mesalimo Karibu, a master's student in climate change, agriculture, and food security at the University of Galway. I'm honored to be here today to talk about something that affects all of us, that is the future of our planet. The climate crisis is one of the most urgent issues that we are currently facing, and in global efforts to tackle it, the Conference of Parties, that is the COP, plays a central role. Next slide, please. This presentation will cover the key topics, potential outcomes, and challenges of the COP29. This briefing was researched by a group of 5, that is myself, Paul Kakumba, Christabel Putin, Brian Mulan, and Min. I will explain what the COP is, then I'll take you through the history of COP, summarize the key takeaways from COP28, and introduce COP29. Then my colleague will pick from there. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the COP stands for the Conference of Parties. It is the supreme decision-making body of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is the UNFCCC. Essentially, the world's governments come together to negotiate actions, set policies, and evaluate progress on climate change. Since the creation of the COP, its goal has mainly been to bring together countries to limit the impacts of climate change, particularly reducing the global emissions and increasing resilience to the impacts of a warming world. It's where, during the COP, it's where the global communities hold self-accountable, discuss the progress, and set the course for future climate action. I'll talk about the history of the COP. The COP has been around for nearly 3 decades, and over the years, it has shaped the way the world responds to climate change. Let's highlight some of the key milestones. Next slide, please. So the first ever COP was held in 1995 in Berlin, Germany. Another key milestone in the history of COPs was COP3, which was held in 1997, that is 2 years later after the first COP. It was held in Kyoto, Japan, where the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. It was the first major international agreement to set legally binding emission reduction targets for developing countries. This marked a significant shift in how we viewed climate actions as a global responsibility. Next was another milestone was the COP21, which was held in Paris in 2015. This is perhaps the most famous moment in the history of COP because this is where the Paris Agreement was formed. Nearly 200 countries signed on agreeing to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, aiming for 1.5 degrees Celsius. An agreement also introduced a system of nationally determined contributions, that's the NDCs, where each country sets its own emission reduction targets. This was a breakthrough in recognizing that climate action must be both globally and locally driven. So the COPs that followed after the Paris Agreement that is COP24 to 27, were held between 2018 and 2022, and they're mainly focused on operationalizing of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So as we introduce COP29, it's important to briefly go through the previous COP, that is COP28. So what happened at the COP28? The COP28 took place in United Arab Emirates in 2023. It was a landmark meeting for several reasons. So first and foremost, for the first time, the countries that met at the COP came up with the global stock tech, where they did the stock tech of the previous COPs, and the results were sobering, since although some progress had been made, they realized that we were still very far in meeting the 1.5 degrees target. Therefore, this underscored the urgency of taking stronger actions in the coming years, and as a result, nearly all countries agreed to transition away from fossil fuels. Away from fossil fuels. Also, there was the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. They mobilized more financial commitment for climate action, and they delivered COP28 UAE, the Declaration of Climate and Health, which was endorsed by 144 countries. Now I'll introduce my colleague to take through the discussion from there. Thank you.
Hello, Ms. Aline. My name is Phương, and now I walk through the most pressing issue at COP29. Next slide, please. So I go through 5 key areas. Next is implementing the Paris Agreement. This ensures countries will remain committed to limit global warming to 1.5 Celsius degree while enhancing transparency in their progress. The second is addressing loss and damage. COP29 will discuss the concept of loss and damage, refer to the negative effect of climate change that occur despite mitigation and adaptation efforts. The third one, finance for climate action. The shift from billion to trillion in the climate finance is crucial. The UN estimate $1.8 trillion annually will be needed in 2030. Next is promoting climate justice. This focuses on equitable policies, ensuring that vulnerable populations are supported. These developed countries often overlook this and creating the significant concession in negotiation. The last one is accelerating renewable energy transition. Finally, scaling up the renewable energy investment and phasing out fossil fuel are the key. Next slide, please. In this slide, we will focus on 2 critical aspects at COP29, which are national determined contribution, NDCs, and new collective quantified goal. For NDCs, they are country-specific climate action plans that outline emission reduction and adaptation strategies. At COP29, the goal is to encourage nations to submit their ambition NDCs aligned with the 1.5 Celsius target by February 2025. However, many nations face barriers such as inadequate financing and limited technologies capacity. That's slowing the progress. For MScCCAFS, this represents a new financial framework replacing the $100 billion annual commitment. And this developing nation will require $1.1 trillion annually by 2025, as I mentioned. The debate is centered on who contribute, how funds are distributed, and whether they take the form of grant or loans. Without resolving these, global climate change will remain insufficient. Next slide, please. And finally, in COP with the issues, these are expected outcomes. The first is for Paris Agreement implementation. we strengthen the commitment and enhance transparency mechanism. With loss and damage fund operational, the loss and damage fund will lead to new financial pledge. The vulnerable nation, particularly in the global south, are counting on this development. Next is on the issue of climate finance. Achieving consensus on MScCCAFS will mark a critical milestone, ensuring predictable and sufficient funds for mitigation and adaptation. Fourth, regarding climate justice, the policies promoting equity in climate finance distribution will empower underrepresented populations. Lastly, the renewable energy transition should be prioritized initiative to phase out fossil fuels and scale up renewable will build momentum toward a sustainable future. And next, my colleague will discuss about the breakthrough and missing opportunities and also the challenge. Yeah.
Thank you, Fang. I will explain about opportunities and strategies. Please, next slide. Opportunities for influence and impact around the UNFCCC process break down into global and national areas. Will it be breakthrough or just another missed opportunity? We will discuss it. The global opportunities related to consensus under two formats, the formal negotiation and mandated event. The more ambitious, robust, detailed, and comprehensive global consensus, the greater the potential impact in the follow-up. Under global opportunities, SSGWA, the key negotiation on agriculture and food security made progress in Bonn at SP60 in June 2024, with an agreement to hold 2 workshops over the next 2 years. Second, MScCCAFS on climate finance is probably the biggest issue on the table at COP29. For now, a lot of conversation is about the structure and the mechanism. Hence, at COP29, a total goal should be agreed. GGA, or Global Goal on Adaptation, and the UAE Belém Work Program is critical element of the negotiation, referring to the framework to set targets that will guide global adaptation effort. And this GGA is a collective commitment under Article 7.1 of the Paris Agreement proposed by African Group of Negotiators in 2013 and established in 2015. GGA means to serve as a unifying framework that can drive political action and finance for adaptation on the same scale as mitigation. Under mandated event, the picture is much less complex. These events are particularly themes and issues like gender, children, youth, and another topic that, where countries share approach and best practice. Nothing is agreed and negotiated in the mandated event. Next, please. National opportunities relate to member state action like producing NDC, NAP, or another initiative, or maybe forming group of countries. This year, countries are submitting their first biennial transparency review, which will provide insight into national level progress towards stated goal. Furthermore, many significant COP activities take place outside the formal negotiating hall. They can be a good opportunity for countries to strengthen their partnership and share more technical opportunities or maybe collaboration to accelerate climate action progress. One of the key flagship pieces of the research that are expected in COP29 is the full version of FAO roadmap. Next, please. At COP28 in Dubai, nearly 200 countries agreed to move away from fossil fuel and to the end of the fossil fuel era. However, no real progress has followed, and this COP29 agenda lacks of any mention of that last year deals. Adding complexity is the US presidential election. A Trump win could mean a repeat exit. from climate commitments. Research by Ma and Song in 2024 highlight how COP discussions have shaped the emotional tone of climate diplomacy over 26 years. The terms that evaluated were adaptation, mitigation, financing, development, and disaster, which were important and frequent terms over time. Positive sentiment toward mitigation was predicted by Annex 1 countries that are from developed nations. They can control their action and income to use mitigation with positive sentiment compared to non-Annex 1 countries, which are the developing nations. Sad story, at COP15 in 2009, controversy arose when a draft document intended as a post-Kyoto agreement was leaked. This draft, prepared by only few parties, proposed non-binding commitment, required developing countries to implement mitigation and tied funding to their mitigation action. Developing countries reacted angrily, feeling excluded from the process, and no new agreement was adopted. We want that event happen again in this COP29, despite geopolitical headwinds. Next, please. Several key issues are expected to dominate COP29, with climate finance leading the agenda. First, we need to ensure that delegates' profiles are vital because they bring unique national perspective to climate negotiation. We need to ensure that agreements are inclusive and relevant to each country's needs. Examining their backgrounds and potential hidden agenda allow us to better understand their motivation and anticipate how this might influence critical policy on the climate action. Second, MScCCAFS will be the main deliverable this year, but almost every detail like how much the amount, who pays, who receives it, how long it will last for, whether this fund will come or as a grant or loans, and will it include funding for loss and damage are still in dispute. Third, COP29 may finally establish rule on carbon trading under Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, but some of challenge persist, such as how we can define what counts as carbon credit and how to ensure transaction transparency. Next, COP29 will work towards creating universal green taxonomy with challenges like defining natural gas as transition fuel, but how the mechanism and enforcement will be are still unknown. Transparency will be a key focus, with a Baku Global Climate Transparency Platform will help countries to report their accountability on emission, policy, and financial contribution. Azerbaijan is also calling for new financial pledge that has launched a voluntary fund for contribution from oil and gas country. Finally, one possible decision to watch is the selection of the host for the COP31 in 2026. Australia, supported by US, UK, France, and Germany, want to co-host the summit with Pacific Island nation. But Turkey is also a contender. We will see later whether Australia receives more support from the Europe and other countries to secure the hosting right. As we look to COP29, we will hold on to the hope that world leaders will move beyond a unified action, embracing the urgency of the climate crisis. Will COP29 be the year that we can save our planet, or is it just another excuse for world leaders to travel? That's all from our group. We will give back to the Professor Charles Spillane. Thank you.
That's really super, and thanks to the students in our first group for that really excellent overview on the first day of COP29 of all of the issues on the table, on the the challenges leading up to COP29, and then what our expectations are of the negotiations on the multiple topics that need to be advanced in these negotiations over the next 2 weeks. At that, I think we will close this particular briefing. We will return with our next briefing number 2 with another group of our master's students, group number 2, and that will be next Monday, midway through the 2 weeks of COP29. And at that particular briefing, I'll be at COP29 myself with colleagues from the University of Galway, and also we will bring in others from disparate interest groups in relation to the climate change negotiations to get their perspectives, in addition to the students, on how the negotiations are proceeding at COP29. So we look forward to seeing you all again in a week's time, and hopefully we will have good news on many fronts in relation to the progress of the negotiations at COP29. So thank you all for joining our briefing number 1 today. This briefing will be is being recorded and will be available on the Ryan Institute YouTube channel for anybody who wants to watch it subsequently, and do feel free to share it with any others that who may find it useful as a briefing. So thank you all, and thanks for your attendance, and thanks also to our students for the wonderful briefing, which is a benefit, I think, to us all. Thank you.